All right, welcome to my new channel. Just start making small videos just about whatever's on my mind. One of the things that's been on my mind is to actually try and nail down a top 10 list of my favorite movies of all time. Anybody that's watching has thought about this, especially if they're into movies as much as I am. And I think my movie choice is very far removed from mainstream. Now, there are, I believe, 2 or 3 mainstream movies on here, I guess, that I would classify them as. Maybe more. Maybe now they're considered mainstream. I wanted to actually sit down and think about what my favorite movies were or are. And I would say all of these movies, in some way, sort of define the type of movie that I enjoy. I mean, I think maybe there's one on here that probably doesn't fit that mold, but that's probably more of a guilty pleasure. I'm sure there's people that, I've spoken to before about my favorite movies. It's been hard for me to sort of nail it down because, typically what I do is if there's a certain type of movie, it's going to be classified as something. There's few movies out there, like whether it's horror, whether it's action, whatever it is, they all sort of belong in their own like genre of movie. So I have separate lists for all the genres and stuff. Like I have a different list for, my favorite horror movies and stuff. There's horror movies on this list, but I think this has to be a definitive top 10 for me. Although I guess now it's top 12. All right. So enjoy this video. And yeah, so this is my top 12 favorite movies of all time. I'm going to go over the first of my honorable mentions, and that's A Quiet Place, directed by John Krasinski, and I think it came out in I want to say around 2018, I think. It could have been 2017. Stars Emily Blunt and John Krasinski. This movie was fantastic. If you haven't watched it, I definitely suggest you give it a watch. What I think this movie absolutely nails and why I like it so much is the world that it creates, and it doesn't really show a lot of it. Most of humanity has been wiped out because of these creatures. The atmosphere and the world that it creates within the first, I think, 20 minutes is it's fantastic. And that's why it makes my honorable mentions list. It doesn't quite come close to actually squeezing its way into my top 10. I think my top 10 is actually more meaningful movies to me, more movies that influenced me in some way. But this has to go on there just because of the world that it creates and the fantastic writing that was done here. And well, I guess it is aliens that do sort of land and start, wiping out humanity kind of thing. The other thing that sort of keeps this out of my top 10 is I didn't like the design choice for the alien. I thought it was very generic. Yeah, it's different because it has, how it functions and stuff like that. But I think the way they actually chose to design the alien was kind of generic. I think they could have done a bit better job. Like for a creature that we hadn't seen before, it's different. These sort of resembled like xenomorphs kind of, except they had really big ears. So I didn't really like the design choice of the alien. So that's probably one of the reasons why I kept it out of my top 10. So yeah, that's the first of my honorable mentions. All right, so now I come to my second of honorable mentions. And I had to pick a Christopher Nolan Batman. And I decided to go with The Dark Knight Rises, simply based on Tom Hardy's performance as Bane. I think by and far, he makes this movie what it is. Did enjoy this better than The Dark Knight and I think Heath Ledger actually did a fantastic job as Joker. But I think what edges The Dark Knight Rises, based on the two performances, I think Tom Hardy's was good. Yeah, I think Heath Ledger's was good as well. But I think the atmosphere of this movie, there's a very deep undertone with this movie. I think you notice it more when Bane actually takes over the city. And there's, everyone is afraid, and there's this whole tension. There's this whole atmosphere. Atmosphere for me, atmosphere, tension, character development, and stuff like that takes precedent when I watch a movie. And I think because of that, I think that's why The Dark Knight Rises edges out The Dark Knight. And I think if I were to say something negative about Dark Knight Rises, I guess negative, it would have to be the need to cram all of these characters into this movie. I mean, we could have had Catwoman. We also have Robin, I guess, quote unquote, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and we also have Ra's al Ghul's daughter, who I forget her name at the moment, but so we have all these characters that they're trying to fit in, and it sort of detracts from the overall. I think if they had kept it to maybe just Catwoman and Bane and Batman, or maybe Ra's al Ghul's daughter and Bane and Batman, and just kind of sort of kept that, it felt like the other stuff was sort of tacked in. It's like, oh, we have to get somebody else in this movie, so let's put Catwoman in. Oh, we have to get another person in this movie, so let's put Robin, in case we decide to do another movie, another Batman movie. We have somebody else that's not Christian Bale playing Batman, and I just think that alone sort of keeps it out of my top 10. But yeah, The Dark Knight Rises, I think, is just the best of the trilogy. I think it might have been different if Heath Ledger was still around, and it might not have had that. It might have been maybe Joker and Bane, which I think would have been fantastic. But we have what we have, and I think Dark Knight Rises for me is the best of the Nolan trilogy.
Or perhaps he's wondering why someone would give him a treat before throwing him into that cage.
The first movie in my top 10 is Captain America: Civil War. Now, it's not a very popular choice, and unlike most of the movies on my list, it doesn't really fit into the atmosphere, tension sort of thing. Well, it does kind of, but in terms of character development, I think Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and Chris Evans as Captain America, the conflict that they have and the tension that is between the two of them, where one believes one way and the other believes another way, and they sort of clash in their opinion. You can see where Captain America is right, and you can see where Iron Man is right. That sort of gives you not every choice in life is ever going to be easy. And I think that's what this movie nails in comparison to all of the other Marvel movies. And I think this even edges out Infinity War for me. When I think about the Marvel Universe, I always think about the fight towards the end between Iron Man and Captain America. And I think the lengths that they're willing to go to sort of prove their point or their side, and it sort of bubbles over, and we get to that conflict between those two characters and those two actors. The actors that play these characters, it's real, it's palpable. There's a feeling of tension when towards the end, and then you actually think one of them is going to kill the other. It just that to me just was what superhero movies should strive for. This movie, I believe, also is the first to introduce us to the Black Panther, and the Black Panther was one of my favorite superheroes growing up, and the costume and everything. I loved his character. So that's a big part of it as well. This also gives us the introduction to the Winter Soldier, which has some implications down the road as well. So even these characters that are introduced, so like with The Dark Knight Rises, you had these characters that just felt superficial. They were just on the outside. They're there to be there, sort of. And with this one, you have all these characters that actually have meaning in terms of why they're there. There's specific reasons why these characters are here. And like I said, I think it beats out Infinity War just by a bit, because the Infinity War was more about Thanos and his character. But when I take it as a whole, Civil War to me it has that character development between Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans. That's the most notable part for me. It's just that, and then the story, and then all these interconnecting parts. So yeah, I think Civil War for me has to be the best Marvel movie, and that's why it makes my top 10. So the number 9 spot is taken up by a movie that came out in 1988, not 1998, and it's Willow. And it's directed by Ron Howard. It stars Val Kilmer, Warwick Davis, and Joanne Whalley. There's a few other people in there as well. This movie is definitely one of those ones that is a guilty pleasure. And there's a reason why this makes my top 10. It was the first, growing up, I was very into Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy books and Dragonlance and all those kinds of things. The majority of movies that were made back then, back in the 80s and 70s and stuff, were, I mean, Conan was pretty decent and stuff, but they were more adult, right? And I was far too young to be going to the movie theaters to watch those. I did eventually watch them and stuff, but this makes the list simply because of when I was young, I always wanted to see like a live action fantasy movie, and this did it in spades. I think this was the first movie that I remember watching. There's a few other ones, a bit lower in budget and stuff, but I remember watching this. I thought, like, this is what fantasy movies could be. You know, none of this trashy stuff that came out before. It was never really taken seriously. I think this was one of the first movies that actually, was taken seriously in a way, I guess. But you have like Val Kilmer, who absolutely steals the show as Mad Mardigan. You know, you have Warwick Davis, who's been a staple in Spielberg movies and Lucas movies and all that stuff. So very, very talented actor. Just the whole saga of where it starts. This tells a whole story from beginning to end. I mean, most movies do, but this one, it's cohesive for its time. You know, there's tension, there's atmosphere, there's world building. Okay, yeah, the special effects kind of suck, but they suck for nowadays, not for then. For then, they were probably pretty revolutionary. And I think this one just nails all of those things. And the younger kid inside of me is just like, I can't make a list without including this movie on it. It meant so much to me growing up. Like, it was my jam. Now, I didn't so much like the whole, this whole thing is based on this baby and the sort of comic relief that provides. That's fine. To me, this movie doesn't have any negatives, really. And also, Pat Roach as General Kale had to be the most badass character since Darth Vader. I think his whole thing was fantastic. He was a bad guy through and through, and he just wasn't a pushover for our main characters. But this was a brand new creation. I don't think this actually came out of anything. I think George Lucas might have actually wrote this movie. And it's just phenomenal. It's its own world. It's fantastic. So definitely, it won't hold up if you watch it today, but I think it's definitely still, if you like fantasy movies, this is kind of where it all started. It has to make this list. There's no way I can make a top 10 list. When I thought about it, there's no way that Willow doesn't make my top 10. So it comes in at number 9. Number 8. I had to pick one of the Lord of the Rings movies. I think The Fellowship of the Ring by Peter Jackson came out in 2001. I think it makes my list because if Willow was the beginning of making fantasy movies more mainstream, I think The Fellowship of the Ring is one of those movies that it was the culmination of that. It brought, the fantasy genre, those things very much into the mainstream. Now, that's fine that it brings it into the mainstream, but at the same time, it was also a good movie. So I mentioned in Willow that, fantasy movies were they were low budget and stuff like that. The Fellowship of the Ring really took the ball and ran with it in terms of special effects. It was groundbreaking with all the special effects that it had. The story was great. You had all the performances by everybody in this movie. It was fantastic. I think it changed the way people view movies. And for me personally, like on a personal level, I just never expected to see something like this on screen, and it did have an impact on me. It legitimized that little kid inside of me that's still always there, that likes fantasy and D&D and all that kind of stuff. It just made it like, hey, you know what? There's other people that enjoy this stuff too, and it was so popular, but it was such a good movie at the same time. I had to pick The Fellowship of the Ring because it was the first one. The Two Towers was also good, and I wanted to put the whole trilogy, but I thought that would be cheating, so I just decided to go with the first one. I think it has a good story. It builds the foundation, the world, everything. And if you've ever tried to read The Lord of the Rings, like any of them, it's very difficult, especially if you're a kid or something like that and you're trying to get into it. It's a very difficult read. There's a lot of really big made-up words in it that sort of detract, I think, a little bit from the book. And I think Peter Jackson, phenomenal job. And it definitely follows in the footsteps of Willow, where Willow started In the 80s, we get to Fellowship of the Ring. And I think that progression over that period of time in terms of fantasy movies, I don't think there was really any fantasy movies between Willow and Fellowship of the Ring, honestly. Well, what I consider like high fantasy, right? Like elves and dwarves and all that kind of stuff. It's got everything that I look for in a movie. And that's why it comes in at number 8 for me on my list. Like I said, I didn't want to put the whole trilogy, but I thought that would be cheating. So I just decided to pick one, and it happens to be Fellowship of the Ring. All right, so for number 7, I had to go. This one's one of the ones that I said before about being a guilty pleasure. Shaun of the Dead, 2004, written, directed by Edgar Wright. I believe actually Simon Pegg also has a writing credit on this. Stars Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. For somebody like me that loves zombie movies, it was the melding of two genres. So we have comedy and we have zombie movies. But it wasn't a zombie movie that didn't take itself seriously. It was serious when it had to be, and it had some comic relief. And everything was paced. Everything was directed well. Everything was put together properly and gave us a good story, and not something that's just schlocky. I can pretty much watch any zombie movie. It doesn't really matter. But I think this one here is that perfect meld of a movie that has some serious elements into it. It's also not cheesy. It's also not cringeworthy. There's a lot of really good parts in this. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost are just phenomenal in this movie. And for me, put them on the map. I'd never seen anything. I remember watching it for the first time, and it was like, man, that was one of the best zombie movies I've ever seen. There's no way I can make a top 10 list without having this movie on it. I think if I were to do a list of comedy movies, this is probably would be my number 1, I think. There's probably a lot out there, but I think, for right now, this definitely being the 1 or 2 for sure. But for now, this has just got to sit at number 7. But it's absolutely must watch, I think, if you like zombie movies. But definitely worth the watch. I loved it, and that's why it's on my list at number 7. So for number 6, I put in Attack the Block.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
All right, so I decided to re-record my number 6. I had originally placed Attack the Block in this spot, but after giving it a lot of consideration, there was a movie that I had forgotten about, and it's kind of weird to actually forget about a movie that would make your top 10, but I think I'm actually going to have to go with my number 6 as The Princess Bride. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Again, it kind of goes along with that whole fantasy genre. The Princess Bride creates it's a great world. It's its own world. It's unique. There's a lot of different things that I love about this movie. I guess it's an okay/good romance, comedy, fantasy movie. So it does meld a lot of different genres together, which I really like. And of course, we have Carrie Elwes, Mandy Patinkin, and of course Andre the Giant. And there's a few other. Billy Crystal's in this as well. There's a lot of really good things to like about this movie. It's just one of those movies that for some reason it just always stuck with me. I don't know if it was the fantasy. I don't know if it was the humor. I don't know if it was the fact that when I first watched it, I was really into wrestling and, had Andre the Giant in it. I don't know, but it's just one of those movies that always stuck with me. And when I started thinking about going through my list, it was just a movie that I had actually kind of forgotten about, and I'd forgotten how much I loved it, because I think I probably would have ranked this as number 1. So I can't not include The Princess Bride here. Again, if you like action, comedy, romance type movies with a bit of a fantasy background, kind of. I guess it would be fantasy because there's like a bunch of different things that, there's giants, obviously, like Andre the Giant, who plays Physic, I believe his name is. It's got a lot of different things going on, and, Andre the Giant turns in as good a performance as somebody like him could. Very memorable, very funny in the movie. I really liked him in this. Carrie Elwes, Mandy Patinkin, of course. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. That's where that meme comes from. So there's a lot of things that I really liked about this movie. And after reviewing and going through and editing this video, and I started giving it some more thought, Attack the Block, while a great movie, and I really like it, just I can't really put it into my top 10. Not to say that it was a bad movie at all. I just, The Princess Bride has so much more that I enjoyed. And again, this is one of those things that over time does tend to change with top 10 lists, as everybody's does, as new movies come out, as you discover new movies and stuff like that. But for right now, number 6 has to be The Princess Bride. All right, so now we get into my top 5. And this was a difficult choice because I think this movie, for a lot of geeks and nerds and all that kind of stuff, I think this movie actually makes it into probably everybody's list. But that aside, for my number 5, I had to choose a Star Wars movie. It wasn't going to be a prequel. It's not going to be any of the sequels. So I had to go with the original trilogy, obviously. This one, Empire Strikes Back, like I said, it's probably on everybody's list. But for me, it makes my list. I think it is objectively the best Star Wars movie. I think it does everything properly. You have the reveal, you have everything. But for me, on a personal level, this was the first Star Wars movie that I ever watched in the theater. I went with my dad and my sister. And I mean, I don't remember it from then. I don't remember watching it. I actually believe the first Star Wars movie that I actually watched was Return of the Jedi, that I actually remembered. Like I remember waiting for that movie to come out. But Empire Strikes Back, I has to go with Empire Strikes Back just because I think it was a better movie than Return of the Jedi. Even though I think maybe Return of the Jedi has a little bit more sentimental value, this has just as much. So I think it's close. So I had to give it to the better movie. And I think, what can you say about Empire Strikes Back that hasn't already been said a million times over? But I had to include it, and it is my number 5. All right, so now we're into the meat of it. We're into the heart of my list, I think. With what I put down now as my number 1, might have been my number 3 or number 4 at one point, my number 2. But at number 4, I have The Shining, 1980, Stanley Kubrick, Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall. You have Nicholson's performance, which is phenomenal. You have Shelley Duvall's performance, which is phenomenal. Although I've heard that, there were certain things that sort of went on in this movie that don't make me like what Stanley Kubrick sort of did. But I think what he was trying to do was get people into these roles and get the best performance out of them. Now, did he go too far in certain instances? I'm sure he did. I'm sure this isn't the only movie that he did this with. But what more can you say about a movie that, has everything that I love? It has character development. It has the atmosphere is so thick in this movie. It's so unbelievably, there's so much tension in this. The way it's filmed, the way it's shot, the way the performances of the actors, the kid, it's scary. It's Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece. I know Stephen King has said that it's not quite the way the book happens. I haven't read the book. So the meaning behind this for me and why it makes my list, other than being a phenomenal movie, because I think it's the only Stanley Kubrick movie I actually like. I wasn't a fan of Space Odyssey. I thought that was really boring. This was a movie that actually really made me interested in Stephen King. So because of this movie, I sort of got into reading like Stephen King books. I can't remember the first time I watched this, but it was definitely a lot later than after it was released and stuff. So unlike some of these other movies that it was actually there the day that they came out and stuff. I actually went to see them in theater. It is the perfect blend of things that I like in my movies. If it's believable, if the characters are portrayed well, there's some development, they go from being something to something else. Again, atmosphere, tension, world building, all that stuff. I've said it 1,000 times already in this list. It is personified, I think, in this movie. We have Scatman Crothers, I think. Scatman Crothers was, Dick Halloran. Phenomenal actor, great role here. The imagery, the imagery in this movie was phenomenal. Like, it just, everything that he was trying to show you is just a sort of dark, twisted vision of this hotel seemingly possessed, although I think they sort of changed that later. But for right now, this sits at my number 4.
Got the shinin'.
You mean shining?
Shh! You wanna get sued? Now look, boy, if your dad goes gaga, you just use that shin of yours to call me and I'll come a running. But don't be reading my mind between 4 and 5. That's Willie's time.
All right, so now we get into my top 3. And at number 3, I have the original Halloween by John Carpenter. It came out in 1978, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Donald Pleasance. Both give phenomenal performances. But, I actually think this was Jamie Lee Curtis's first movie. And I am a huge John Carpenter fan.
Sometimes they say huge.
I remember watching this movie. I think the very first time I ever watched this was like 8, maybe. And it scared the bejesus out of me. But this one is on my list for a lot of reasons. It doesn't have much in the way of character development. It's a slasher movie, I guess. But I think it's more than that. I think it does something with that genre that actually didn't even exist at that time. This is one of those movies that I think, in hindsight, when you look back at it, it's what a slasher movie should be. You have the genre of slasher, which is just a blood and guts fest or whatever. That's fine if you like that kind of thing. This has the fear of the unknown in it. And I think with Nick Castle, I believe, was the original The Shape in this. It's just you don't get to see what is actually going on. So if you put yourself in the seat of someone going to see this the very first time, it's kind of a different form of filmmaking, because I don't think horrors were probably more, it's scary but it's not scary. This had that creeping dread over it. I think, I guess in the reveal at the end is not the biggest thing in the world, but I think just the atmosphere that this movie creates, I think it's phenomenal, and it should be commended. John Carpenter, his movie making is second to none, I think, in terms of world building and atmosphere. It does what I like the most in movies, and it does it probably the best out of any other movie on this list. It has that buildup of tension and the fear of the unknown. But yeah, phenomenal movie. Donald Pleasance just absolutely kills it in this. You have a British actor who comes over and does a movie that he's probably not used to, but he just nails the role, I think. He's much like Sir Alec Guinness in Star Wars, where you have this British actor that's very well known over in their home country, and then they come here and we put them in a different type of role. And I think Donald Pleasance really nails it in here. I think even in the subsequent sequels, the sequel number 2, and then going into 4, 5, and 6, I think he's still the best thing about those movies. But yeah, this to me, I absolutely love this movie. My sister was, I believe this was one of her favorite movies, and it sort of became one of my favorite movies through osmosis, probably. Rob Zombie's movies, not a fan, really. They're fine. They didn't capture that tension, it doesn't have that essence to it. It doesn't capture what this movie captured. I think this has been my number 1 at times, but my number 3, Halloween, John Carpenter, 1978, phenomenal. I love this movie. All right, so number 2, I have to go back to the granddaddy of all zombie movies, and Night of the Living Dead. Now, I say that with a caveat, because as much as I think George Romero's Night of the Living Dead was groundbreaking and he defines what a zombie is and stuff, I think Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead that came out in 1990 with Tony Todd and Patricia Tallman, they tell the story with unbelievable things, but all the characters find it believable. As much as Romero's Night of the Living Dead was hailed as one of the best zombie movies of all time, I think Tom Savini's basically a shot-for-shot remake, but the story flows better. If you look at Romero's, it's sort of, there's segments of the story that are just basically put together, sort of like this video probably. It's edited where it's filming in chunks and then putting it all together as one. And that's kind of what Night of the Living Dead, Romero's version, feels like. Just the cleanliness, the more focused the story is in Night of the Living Dead, you sort of see Romero's vision, but you see it in a much more cohesive film. And Tom Savini, and he paid homage to Romero 100% with this. Like I said, I think it's a shot-for-shot remake. Then if you take the story and you add special effects, you add to it. You basically take the same story, fill in the little things. The special effects weren't terrible in the original Night of the Living Dead, but when you take it to sort of the next level, I think the movie definitely becomes better, right? There's certain things that, it has to blend a bunch of elements together. And I just think Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead takes everything from the original and puts it with Tony Todd, who was phenomenal. You have Patricia Tallman, I think, did a fantastic job as well. If I look at the story, the way that it's told, the story is groundbreaking in a lot of ways. I don't really want to get into that side of it, but like for me, Night of the Living Dead has to be my favorite zombie movie of all time. I believe I saw this the first time in 92 or 93, probably, I think. And from that moment on, I became a massive zombie fan. I love zombie movies. It is my favorite genre. There's no detractions from this movie. And if I look at Romero's version, I can say, oh, okay, the special effects, they're not that great. The story, it's not that cohesive. It kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense. But with this one here, like I said, it's cleaned up. I understand Romero is the godfather of zombies. I think when you look at both of these movies, I think Savini's edges it out ever so slightly. So yeah, Night of the Living Dead is my number 2. All right, so now we get to my number 1. This has to be John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, starring Kurt Russell, Keith David, Wilford Brimley, and a few others. This movie to me, it encapsulates everything that I love in movies. It's the atmosphere, it's the world building, it's the character development. This movie has all of those things in spades. It's unfortunate that the remake didn't quite capture a lot of this, and I think a lot of it had to do with some of the acting. I think the actors here are definitely better than the remake, but I also think the remake just went more with the sci-fi element of it and didn't go with the mystery of who might be one of the creatures and who might not be one of the creatures. I think that it adds just a whole nother layer to this movie. So when I sit down and I think about where this movie belongs, and I've said with other movies on this list that they're sometimes interchangeable, but I don't think The Thing really would ever change out of the number 1 spot. It has everything that I enjoy, everything that I would go to a movie and see and I'd want to see, and everything that I judge other movies on. I really wish the remake had done this one justice. When I talked about Night of the Living Dead by Tom Savini and George Romero, this sort of had the potential to be the same thing, where we updated our special effects, but it felt like they wanted to change where they went with it. I think if it had been a shot-for-shot remake, it actually would have made the new one a much better film overall. I didn't quite like the actors in the new one. We have the older generation of actors give us a bit more believability in this. I just think they just come from an older school of acting where you have to rely on your skill rather than have the special effects carry the movie. And even if they did decide to change the story slightly, like the base of the story is we have this group of Arctic explorers and the creature infiltrates their camp and then it's able to take over their bodies and stuff like that. And I think if they had actually kept with that, although I think the new one was actually like it was either a prequel sequel or a sequel prequel. I don't know. I think that's what sort of also muddied the water with the new one as well. And I think you also have John Carpenter's ability to create a score for his movies. So he made the theme for Halloween. He also did it with this one as well. There's a few scenes where they don't really show much. They're just kind of like panning through hallways and they're showing the outside, the exterior with the fire, and there's just this sort of like a heartbeat pulse kind of theme music going on, and that adds to the atmosphere. It adds to the feeling of the emptiness of the Arctic.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished. If none of us make it, at least there'll be some kind of record. The storm's been hitting us hard now for 48 hours. We still have nothing to go on.
And that, like, all that stuff helps, and that's something that the remake just didn't have. They didn't, they try to rely too much on special effects. So unlike, Tom Savini's update of Night of the Living Dead, he sort of kept it as a shot for shot, but he didn't really try to change a whole lot about it. Updated the special effects, the way the zombies looked, the way they moved, the fact that the movie was in color, actually in color, not that thing where it's in black and white and then they update it to color and it looks really weird. I understand not wanting to do a complete remake, but I think it just didn't quite fit. It didn't quite hold together very well. This was taken from The Thing from Outer Space, although I've never watched that. I can't praise this movie enough. Even if you haven't watched it, I definitely think you should watch it. I think this was John Carpenter's magnum opus. I think it really captured everything that he does as a filmmaker, as a writer, director, everything. I think it just gets all of it right. You know, when I came to watch it later, again, this is one of those movies that I love through osmosis from my sister. It means a lot. Like, both John Carpenter movies that are on this list, you know, hold a special place in my heart. Night of the Living Dead does edge out Halloween because my fascination with zombies. It just nails everything that I want out of a movie. You know, when I sit down, watch a movie, this is what I want. So The Thing, John Carpenter, 1982. It's a pretty old one. But yeah, so Thing, number one. Yeah, it surprises me too. All right, so there you have it. That's my top 10. Well, I guess it ended up being top 12 list. Most of these movies on this list are sort of a relic of a bygone era, and you don't get them anymore. But these ones really define who I am as a movie watcher, and, you know, the love that I have for movies. And like I've said already, the love that I inherited from my sister for watching movies and appreciating movies. And these movies have affected me at some point in my life. So I don't think there's any way, well, most of them have anyway. Some of them I just really, really like. And some of them have impacted movies as a whole. That's sort of why, you know, I wanted to start a new channel, start doing movie reviews and stuff like that. But before I start reviewing movies, you have to sort of know what I judge other movies on, and sort of my tastes, and that's why I decided to do this list first. If you haven't seen any of these movies on this list, I definitely recommend watching them. I'm sure most of you have seen Fellowship of the Ring and Captain America and stuff like that, but I'm like stuff like The Thing that you may not have watched, or Princess Bride for sure, Willow, again, if you haven't watched it, I mean, you go back and we'll give it a watch. It's definitely worth it. But yeah, that's my top 10, and welcome to my new channel, and thanks for watching. See ya.